Welcome to Life Stories. In today's episode, we dive into a journey of self-discovery, love, and the courage it takes to break free from expectations. Join me as I share a personal story of how I learned to embrace who I truly am. No longer driven by the need to please others but by the desire to live authentically. This is a tale of growth, understanding, and the profound lessons that come with it. So sit back, relax, and let's begin this story together. Don't forget to subscribe to stay tuned for more life stories. Growing up, I always knew something was off. I had always been the quiet one, the one who kept to herself and just did what was expected. But it was hard not to notice the glaring differences in how my parents treated me and my younger brother, Jake. From the moment he was born, it was as though the sun itself shifted, and all the attention and affection were pointed in his direction. It wasn't that I was neglected, at least not in the traditional sense, but it was clear to me, early on, that I was never going to be the favorite. Jake was the golden child, the apple of our parents' eyes, the boy who could do no wrong, no matter how much trouble he got into. When he struggled in school, the teachers were at fault. When he wrecked his first car, my parents didn't even raise their voices, they simply bought him another one. But me? I was the responsible one. The one who never got any praise, but always had to be the one to hold things together. When I asked for help with anything, schoolwork, money, or even just some encouragement, I was met with dismissiveness, even a little bit of coldness. I was expected to just handle it, to take care of myself, to be the mature one. It didn't matter that I was just a kid. It was as if being an afterthought was my job. The most painful part of it all was how my parents would speak about Jake. They spoke of him as though he were destined for greatness, as though all he needed was a little push to unlock his full potential. Every time I heard those words, I felt like a little piece of me was chipped away. My hard work, my dedication, my sacrifice, it all felt meaningless. But I wasn't one to complain. I knew how to keep my feelings to myself. So I just kept going, quietly, without ever expecting anything from them. I didn't have the luxury of being carefree like Jake. While he was out partying and making mistakes, I was studying relentlessly, working part-time jobs to pay for books and tuition. I didn't have time for friends or social events because I knew if I didn't make it on my own, no one was going to help me. I earned every single scholarship I received, every opportunity that came my way. And, despite all of this, I never once heard my parents ask how I was doing, if I needed anything, or if they were proud of me. They never said a word. It was as though I wasn't even on their radar. Just a backdrop to the spectacular performance that was Jake. When college acceptance letters came in, I held my breath, hoping for the best. I had worked tirelessly for this moment, putting everything I had into my studies. When I got the scholarship to attend the University of California, it felt like a victory not just for me but for everything I had done to prove my worth. My heart soared, but when I told my parents, their reaction was lukewarm at best. My mother simply said, "That's nice, dear," and went back to talking about Jake's potential. And Jake? He wasn't even interested in what I had accomplished. He was too busy with his own life. I worked harder than anyone I knew to make it through college. Double majoring wasn't easy, especially with the part-time jobs I had to juggle. But I did it. I was about to graduate summa cum laude, and I had even secured a job offer before finishing my last semester. I was proud of myself. But I had learned long ago not to expect validation from anyone. Especially not my family. Still, I hoped that on my graduation day, maybe things would be different. Maybe they would see me for what I had achieved and finally acknowledge my efforts. But deep down, I knew that hope was a dangerous thing. I didn't know it then, but that day was going to change everything. I had no idea how much my life would shift in the span of a few short hours. The moment I would finally be recognized for all I had sacrificed, only to realize, once again, that I would never be enough in the eyes of the people who should have supported me most. The day of my graduation was one of mixed emotions. I had spent the last 4 years pushing myself beyond limits I didn't even know I had. But as I stood there in my cap and gown, A sense of emptiness washed over me. Everyone around me was smiling, laughing, taking photos with their families. But I felt alone. I had no one there who truly understood what it had taken for me to get to this point. My parents, who I had hoped would finally see me for who I had become, were absent, not physically, but emotionally. Jake was there, of course. He was there for the big moments, the celebrations, the attention, but he wasn't really there for me. He was busy chatting with his friends, all too eager to talk about his plans, his dreams, his endless potential. I don't even think he realized that I needed someone in that moment. I didn't want to burden him with my feelings. Not when he was so caught up in his own world. But in the pit of my stomach, I couldn't help but wonder, why was I always the one who had to handle things alone? It wasn't until the ceremony began, the speakers droning on about the future and success, that I realized something truly painful. As I looked out into the crowd, I saw the other graduates' families, cheering, clapping, hugging one another with genuine love and pride. And then I saw my own family. My mom and dad were sitting there, barely paying attention to what was happening on stage, whispering to each other about something else. They barely noticed when my name was called. And when I walked across the stage to receive my diploma, the applause was lukewarm at best. My mom offered a brief smile, but it was distant, as though the moment didn't belong to me at all. She was too focused on Jake, who was sitting right next to her. I wanted to believe it wasn't intentional. I wanted to think that maybe they were just caught up in their own lives. That maybe they didn't know how deeply it hurt to be overlooked once again. But the truth was, I had lived with this feeling my entire life, the feeling that no matter how much I achieved, no matter how hard I worked, I would never be good enough in their eyes. They would always choose Jake, always give him more than they gave me, always look at him like he was the one who mattered most. When the ceremony ended, I stood alone in the crowd, the weight of the moment sinking in. The world was full of possibility. Yes, but for me, it felt like the only thing that mattered was the approval I would never receive. I tried to hold it together, but the tears were already threatening to fall. I was proud of myself, but there was no one to share that with. I felt like I had been running this entire race by myself. And at the finish line, I was met with nothing but silence. And then it happened. Jake, of all people, approached me, offering a half-hearted congratulations. His words were kind enough, but there was no depth to them. He didn't know what this day meant for me, nor did he care. He was already talking about his next big adventure. And for a moment, I realized that no matter how much I wished for his support, he was just too wrapped up in his own world to give it. It was that moment, the realization that I was truly on my own, that broke me. I felt as though the years of hard work, the years of sacrifice, had amounted to nothing. My parents had always treated me like an afterthought, and Jake was too busy to even recognize the weight of the journey I had been on. I remember standing there, in the midst of the celebrations, feeling like an outsider in my own life. It was in that moment that I made a decision. I would no longer wait for validation from them. I couldn't keep living my life on the sidelines, waiting for a nod of approval that would never come. I had to forge my own path, even if it meant doing it alone. Because in the end, I realized something that should have been obvious to me all along. If I wanted to be happy, I couldn't keep relying on other people to see my worth. I had to see it for myself. In the weeks following graduation, I felt like I was living in a fog. The excitement of finishing my degree had long worn off, leaving me with an overwhelming sense of uncertainty. The future seemed so wide open, but at the same time, it felt paralyzing. I had always been defined by the expectations of my parents and, to some extent, by Jake's shadow. But now, there was a daunting void where my identity once was. I was no longer the overachieving student, the one who had made her family proud. Now, I had to figure out who I was outside of all of that. I began by distancing myself from my family. It wasn't out of anger, but out of a need to breathe, to carve out space where I could figure things out on my own. I realized how much their expectations had shaped me, how much I had shaped my entire life around trying to gain their approval. but it was a hollow pursuit. They hadn't been there for me when I needed them most. And yet I had continued to bend over backward, thinking that somehow their acknowledgement would fill the void inside me. It was like chasing an illusion, a dream that would never come true. I took a job in the city at a small, but growing design firm. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. The first few days were a blur of getting used to the rhythm of the office, learning the ins and outs of my new role, and trying to silence the constant buzz of doubt that lingered in my mind. But as the weeks passed, something began to change. I found a rhythm. I started to take pride in my work, in the small projects that I completed with attention to detail, with care. It was the first time in a long while that I felt like I was doing something for me, something that wasn't for the approval of my parents or to fit into the mold of what they had always envisioned for me. It wasn't easy, though. I missed the comfort of knowing exactly what others thought of me. I missed the predictable rhythm of being in the background, always doing my best to keep things running smoothly. But in that stillness, I began to see something I had been blind to for so long. I had spent my whole life running away from myself. I had been so focused on what others wanted from me that I had completely ignored my own desires, my own passions, my own identity. I had never allowed myself to just be. One afternoon, I met a colleague, Maya, who was older and more experienced than I was. She could tell I was struggling with something, and after a few conversations, she invited me for coffee. "You're in a tough spot," she said gently, "but you're not alone. We all have to learn to step out of other people's expectations at some point." Her words struck me deeply. She didn't know the whole story, but somehow, she had captured exactly what I was feeling. Over coffee, Maya told me her own story of growing up in a family that had always expected her to follow a specific path. She had spent years trying to meet those expectations, only to reach a point where she had to choose: live for herself or continue to live for them. She chose herself, and it was the hardest decision she'd ever made. But she also said that it was the best decision she'd ever made. She had to confront the fear of disappointing people she loved. But in doing so, she had discovered a version of herself that she didn't even know existed. Her story resonated with me in ways I hadn't anticipated. It made me realize that I wasn't the only one who had struggled with the pressure of family, of love, of wanting to be accepted. But what struck me most was how Maya had taken the leap into her own life. She didn't wait for permission or for the approval of others. She made the choice to be herself. And though the path had been hard, it was also one she had built for herself. One that allowed her to finally be at peace. I began to see the truth in her words. The path to independence wasn't easy, but it was the only way forward. I couldn't keep living my life based on the expectations of people who, no matter how much they loved me, would never truly understand the depths of my journey. If I wanted to find fulfillment, I had to start living for myself. That evening, as I returned to my small apartment after work, I felt a shift inside me. I wasn't sure of what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel afraid. I felt free. As time passed, I began to embrace the changes I had made in my life. The path to self-discovery wasn't always smooth, but each small step toward independence brought me closer to understanding who I truly was. I stopped seeking validation from others and started listening to my own heart, which guided me in ways I never thought possible. I realized that true happiness doesn't come from meeting the expectations of others, but from honoring your own dreams and desires, even if they seem different from what others might want for you. My relationship with my family shifted as well. While it was still a work in progress, I began to communicate with them more honestly about my choices. I no longer felt the pressure to meet their standards, and instead, I shared my journey with them, inviting them to see me as I was, imperfect but striving to be authentic. The process was slow, but I began to see that love wasn't just about meeting expectations, it was about accepting each other as we were, flaws and all. Looking back, I could see how much I had grown. The person I was before was still inside me, but she had evolved, shedding the fear of judgment and embracing the power of independence and self-love. Life was no longer about pleasing others, it was about living authentically. making decisions that resonated with my soul, and finding peace in who I was. As I continue to grow, I am more certain that life's greatest lesson is this: to live true to yourself is the most courageous thing you can do. And as I share my story, I hope that you, too, will find the strength to follow your own path, no matter where it leads. To hear more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and stay tuned for future life stories videos.